What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back. Today we're looking at the remastered F5, although we're not actually looking at all the new textures, which are absolutely fantastic. But today we're diving deep into the flight control system, and I've been tuning this airplane for no less than, I want to say, somewhere between 10 to 15 hours so far to tune it exactly, or not exactly, but as close as we can get to real life. In terms of flying it here at home with a force feedback stick. The one I'm using obviously is FFBeast, as a lot of you probably know already, and this thing quite literally is a beast. It generates up to 40 pounds of force when when I pull back, which is absolutely insane for anybody who's never experienced that before. And the real F5 does go up to 40 pounds as well, as we'll go over the flight test data here very shortly. And this is where I need to make a little disclaimer, which is, if you are interested in the flying portion of this sortie, it's going to come in the next video. I have tried already to try and put it all into the one video, but there's just simply way too much to cover, and I really want to get into some of the little details and the intricacies, the difficulties, and some of the things open to interpretation when it comes to tuning an aircraft. But in particular today, it's the F5, using flight test data from the real F5 to try and replicate the same thing, or as close as we can get it, in DCS World with a force feedback stick. So if you're interested in the flight control system, and if you're interested in force feedback stuff in general, then stick around. But if you just want to see me fly and actually talk about how it feels, then unfortunately that's going to have to come in the next video. So without further ado, let's get into it.
We have 2 good engine starts. You're clear to disconnect the headset. We'll see you on the left with the pin. Thanks a lot.
Now, as I've explained many times before, the problem we currently have is that developers such as Belsum now Seagull Dynamics, or any other module for that matter, they simply don't provide enough force feedback information for us, both in terms of documentation and in terms of actual force feedback going through the system, which in our case is through the DirectX channel, which it provides some force feedback, but for systems which can generate an absolute crap ton of force, such as FFBeast, it's simply inadequate. So we have to use the software, which by the way is getting better and better with FFBeast all the time. I mean, now it's just awesome. We can tune all sorts of curves with springs and G-force springs and elevator weights and bob weights, and I mean it's absolutely phenomenal. And now we have a million different shakers, for which perhaps maybe not really as important in terms of actually flying an airplane most of the time, but still really amazing in terms of giving you that extra feel, with landing jolts depending on how hard you touch down, with weapon release jolts in the stick. When you fire the gun, then you have a vibration through the stick. I mean, it's awesome. But those are kind of all secondary effects, and they're not too difficult to tune. In fact, they're all very, very open to interpretation, because a lot of them may not even happen in the real airplane, but it's good to have them in your stick anyway, because we don't have our asses vibrating on our seats, or the throttles vibrating, or the whole cockpit around us vibrating, or whatever it is, when we fire the gun. So that is just an extra bit of information for us, because we're taking all our stuff in through a computer screen. We don't have the same sensory input information that we could otherwise have. So we don't have all that much information to go by, other than what appears to be a flight test report of the real F5 that was sent to me by Max from Just Fly It. If you haven't seen his channel, check it out, but it is in Russian, so you need to be a Russian speaker to understand it. If you happen to be so, then absolutely have a look at it. He is tuning all these airplanes, and he's flown 100 types of different planes in real life as well. And he really understands, the flight control system and how it works. And he has sent me his F5 profile, but unfortunately, some things it doesn't quite work with me, so I've changed a couple of things. Okay, let's get into the meat and potatoes of tuning the F5 with force feedback. Now that we have some software updates for FFBeast, we can tune all sorts of different curves to replicate the way the real aircraft feels in real life. And just as a pure, very quick example, something that's very specific to the F5, which I don't think exists in any other airplane that I've seen, is that when you're flying, or in the air at least, with the gear up, the pilot shouldn't really be able to deflect the ailerons more than half travel. And we can tune that with a curve, which is great. Halfway through, you need to actually apply twice as much force almost to push it through the limit. Now, you can't do that. The manual says an emergency. I guess, you know, that's open to interpretation. You could do that whenever you're dogfighting, maybe. High alpha, you know, when you want maximum aileron deflections. Now, unfortunately, there is a logic that says when the gear is down, then there is no bump stop, if that makes sense, halfway through the aileron travel. You can push, you know, you can basically have a smooth input all the way to the end. The way it works currently in DCS, you know, we just have to work with the air logic only. So on the ground, we still have this bump stop, which we should really have. However, it doesn't really matter because, well, on the ground you're not moving the ailerons anyway, and then when you're in landing configuration, you would almost never use more than half aileron deflection as well. So it doesn't really matter too much. So that's something very specific we can tune with curves, and the DirectX force feedback channel that's providing us information from Eagle Dynamics, from DCS, straight into our force feedback system. I mean, it actually has that modeled as well. If you can just, you know, jack that effect up, and it will sort of, whatever information is coming through the simulator will come through to us in the form of DirectX. However, it's not modeled very well. It's kind of like a kicker when you get to the stop. So Max from Just Fly It has tuned it a bit more like the real aircraft, which is you know, a sort of an actual, what actually feels like a bump stop as opposed to something that kicks the stick back. So anyway, that's an ailerons. I've tuned it pretty much exactly as it's supposed to be. It's about 12 to 14 pounds full deflection either way, and now I'm doing it slightly more scientifically. I'll admit to the fact that before I was a little bit wrong in the way I was doing things, because I was doing it by feel. Now I'm actually measuring it with, you know, with scales, and we can figure out exactly what the real numbers are. Now let's talk about pitch. So the way the system in the F5 works is it's a conventional, very conventional aircraft. It's not fly-by-wire, as well you probably know already. And it uses basically cables and push rods, connects the flight controls to your stick. But there is an artificial feel system for the pilot, as is very common for these types of aircraft, especially from this era, as there was no fly-by-wire. You basically want to give the pilot a sort of feeling when he's maneuvering the aircraft that there is load on the airplane. So when G increases, the stick forces should increase as well. And the way it's done in the F5 is through a bunch of springs and bob weights. So they're there to increase stick forces, or the stick force gradient as G increase, but also they are there to dampen out any jerky movements of the flight controls from the pilot as well. So we can actually tune that in DCS in multiple different ways. And the ideal way of doing it would be to use an effect called elevator weight, which is effectively simulating these sort of bob weights. As you move the stick back, you know, you're getting more pressure on the stick, especially as you're maneuvering the airplane. It doesn't really work for me. Now, I don't know if it's specifically to do with my system and mechanics or whatever. Now, I can use a little bit of it, but I can't use too much of it. On the ground, you should be around about anywhere between 20 to 30 odd pounds, depending on your trim setting for takeoff. Whereas in flight at 5.5 G, I think they have, or about 6 G, it's up to over 40 pounds when you pull back on the stick. And you have to remember that that 40 pounds doesn't occur at the end of the stick's travel. You might only have to displace the stick a third, if not even less, maybe a quarter, to generate that G-force at a certain speed, right, when you're in a hard turn. So already in the air, at this position, you need to be at 40 pounds. But on the ground, you know, at this position, you're probably going to be at, like, I don't know, 10, 15, whereas all the way back is going to be 30, or, you know, between, let's say, 20 and 30. So we need to tune that somehow. Now, bob weights, or elevator weight in FFBeast, doesn't really work for me because it generates a huge amount of oscillations in the stick, and it creates this sort of phugoid oscillation as there is a rebalancing of aerodynamic forces after a maneuver. So in other words, if you were pulling back during a hard turn and then you were to let go of the stick, it would, instead of kind of bouncing back, it would then start to oscillate a lot, and there would be a massive phugoid motion oscillation until it settles finally. And maybe it won't even settle because the bob weights or the elevator weight is just too large, so we'll just keep doing that forever. And even if you don't let go suddenly, you can still feel it in your hand, that momentum of the stick wanting to constantly go back and forth. And I completely understand that maybe to some degree that's absolutely fine, and maybe that's exactly what happens in real life to some degree, but not to a large degree. Otherwise, any pilot would say, I'm not flying this airplane. If he felt this stick constantly wanting to work against him and constantly oscillate after a maneuver, I just can't see it. Now, obviously, I haven't flown the real thing, so there's things open to interpretation, and as like I said before, everything with this, you can't do it exact. There's going to be millions of factors that we just can't take into account, including the CG position, which we don't know in DCS, all of these meteorological ISA condition differences that could result in different forces, density, and whatever. So the problem for me is that I had to find a way of tuning this increase stick force per G effectively, which is what the bob weight's doing. I had to do that with a different way, which is called a G-force spring in FFBeast, which increases, and you can basically tune using these data points for the flight test report. You can, if you pick a certain one, now this is where there's a caveat. In real life, it seems like, you know, the stick force per G will vary with various things like altitude and speed, and I guess that's the kind of way it works with bob weights. But with a G-force spring, that, I mean, we're going to have a constant force. It doesn't matter if we're going to be at 30,000 feet pulling, you know, back on the stick to get the 8G, or 8G, 7.5, 5G, whatever, or if we're going to be, you know, at 500 feet doing the same thing. It's not going to make any difference. The stick force is going to be the same. So there's a caveat here where I understand the real aircraft is going to be a little bit different. But this is the only way that I can ballpark replicate the correct sort of ballpark, the correct G-forces throughout the entire flight envelope within maneuvering the aircraft from, you know, 0G up to, let's say, 8G in our case, but the limit is about 7.5G in the F5. So what I've done is, again, without diving into too many details, you'll see there is a trim setting that we can use for takeoff here, and depending on the trim setting, then that, you know, with a maximum deflection of the stick, that'll give us a certain force. Now, it's between 20 and 30 odd. Without going into details, there is a way of replicating this varying of stick force at maximum deflection with the trim setting, and that is using actually elevator weight. But like I explained, because I don't really like it, because I think it's overpowering when you're flying, I only use a small amount of that, and that's not good enough to replicate the difference in the forces when you're setting different trim settings for takeoff. So I've gone for a medium, and I've just called it 25 pounds on the ground. No matter what trim setting you have, it's going to be ballpark 25. After that, we need to well, first of all, figure out what is our system capable of. So FFBeast is capable of generating 40 pounds. 40 pounds is an absolute crap ton. If anybody has ever felt 40 pounds, if anybody has ever felt 40 pounds after flying in a regular joystick, I mean, you'll literally feel like your arm's going to fall off. I will say there's a reason why I've dialed it back a touch. My maximum at about 6, 7, or approaching 8G is going to be 33 to 35 pounds when I pull back, not 40 odd pounds. The reason for that is twofold. One, I've noticed that if I absolutely stress test my stick at 40 pounds, if I kept it at 40 pounds, now it's very, very rare that you would actually keep your hand and keep it locked like this at 40 pounds for, you know, a long time. But let's just say you're on a spiral descent, you're dogfighting somebody, you just have to keep the 40 pounds constantly. My power supply, when I'm absolutely stress tested, my power supply will cut out and the joystick will stop working and reset itself, recalibrate itself. Not very good if you're flying a simulator. So I've dialed it back a touch for that reason, but I've also dialed it back for another reason, which I believe, and I'm going to get into it now. This could be a slightly controversial topic because I've been thinking about it for a while. And basically what I've noticed is when I measure 40 pounds here on my stick, oh, and by the way, there's another caveat to these flight tests, and this is kind of an important one. I don't know where. Obviously, they have a stick force that they've measured in all these tests. But at what point, where have they measured it? Because this is really important. In my particular case, if I was to measure, say, stick force from the bottom over here versus the top over here, I would get very different readings. I mean, if this was, let's say, 40 pounds at the bottom, there's a good chance that at the top here, this would be like 20 and a bit, or 23, 25. So there's a huge difference. Now, if you have a big lever arm, like in a lot of aircraft, mine was only 5 centimeters, but if you were to have something like 15 centimeters, which I wish I could have, but with my personal home cockpit, it's not really possible, then, you know, the difference wouldn't be as great. So I had to figure out exactly where I need to be measuring. So what I've done is, I've taken the palm of my hand, and when I pull back, I think about where I'm experiencing the most amount of pressure, so like the medium point, right? Obviously, it's not at the top, because with the trigger, well, I can't pull in the trigger, otherwise I would be flying like this, and that wouldn't really work. So I know somewhere closer to the bottom of my palm, somewhere over here, and I'm trying... So I've basically kind of created a point which I think makes sense, which is right about here. This is where I'm measuring everything. Where I feel the most amount of pressure. Now, how they do it in real life, I don't know. Do they actually, is that the same point that they use, or do they use a completely different point to measure the stick force? So again, this is something that's open to interpretation, because like I say, it makes a big difference. But something I have noticed as well is, and again, like I say, it could be a controversial topic, but it's occurred to me recently because I couldn't figure out why, when I go to work and I measure the forces on my Boeing 737 at work, with this thing, by the way, a full controls deflection on the ground with the hydraulics on, you can get about 15 kilos, which is 33 pounds worth of force on the Boeing 737 when you pull the yoke all the way back, right? And without hydraulics, by the way, just for anybody who's interested, is about 26 kilos. So huge amount of force that is required, you know, without hydraulics to pull the yoke all the way back. But even with hydraulics, right, 33 pounds, when I was holding it back, I realized something. I mean, I was like, wow, this is a lot, but I'm kind of, it's not like I'm, you know, I wouldn't want to be sitting there holding it all day, but I can do it. I mean, it's not really that difficult. Whereas when I come here and I pull back 33 pounds on my stick here, I was like, man, this feels like way more than the 737 at 33 pounds. So I was kind of curious, what is going on there? And I have a theory. And my theory is actually to do with your perceived pressure. Even though this thing will be showing you exactly what is, you know, I mean, that's mathematical. It's a number. It doesn't change. But what you perceive is not the same. And let me explain. In the roll axis, a lot of pilots prefer rolling left compared to rolling right. Why is that? Well, because when you push on the stick to the left, you don't have to strain your arm anywhere near as much as you do when you pull to the right. When you pull to the right, your arm muscle, now especially down the side of your arm, and your shoulder muscle tenses up, and you feel like it's nowhere near as comfortable. So although the pressure or the forces are exactly the same, it's harder, my perceived pressure is harder here than it is when I go to the left. And I have a theory that there is something to do with that when you're actually in the longitudinal axis as well. In the 737, I sit upright and I can pull the yoke quite close to my stomach, and therefore I can kind of lock my elbow in at about 90 degrees, and it's a lot easier. My current seating position in the F5 at home is that I'm in an old IKEA chair, which is reclined more like an F-16 guy would be sitting in real life. So if I was to bring myself up, which you can't see in the camera, but if I was to lean forward and have the stick closer to me and then pull all the way back, I can lock my elbow in at 90 degrees, and I can feel that it's a little bit easier to hold this. And this is my kind of point, that with the seating position that I have, it's actually more realistic for the maximum force to be slightly less than what the real aircraft can do. Now, that's just my own deductions. I'm still thinking about it. So maybe I'll change my mind on that at some point, but at the moment, maybe it's a placebo effect. I don't know, but there is something to do with it, at least in my head, that there is definitely a difference depending on how you hold the stick, the angle, and where it is, and how upright you sit. We now have a starting point of 25 odd pounds on the ground, like we've measured from the flight test report, and then I have tuned it exactly like the real aircraft, except I have taken away a little bit from the maximum. Like I say, it's not 40 pounds, it's going to be 33 odd pounds when I pull the stick all the way back from these flight test reports. And the good thing is, because we have a curve for the G-force spring, which is what I've used, which I think Max from Just Fly is going to disagree with me, because a G-force spring is kind of maybe more of a fly-by-wire effect. You know, would have an F-18 maybe for stick force per G, but it works well in the F5 at least to have a ballpark to replicate what the bob weight would do. because like I say, I can't use the bob weight effect in FFBeast because it causes too many oscillations in my opinion when you jack it up to the point that you really want to. So I only use a small elevator weight just to give me that slight rebalancing of aerodynamic forces when there's a sudden change at speed. But otherwise, I've used a G-force spring to replicate ballpark what the F5 does. And I've used the graph here, which is a 0.6 Mach at 10,000 feet. And I've tuned it basically the way it's supposed to be. So up to about 4, 5, and 5.5 G, you know, is where, or maybe even closer to 6G, is where I'm starting to reach my limit of 33 to 35 pounds. And otherwise, the curve is pretty much the same. And it provides an absolutely amazing feel in flight, which we'll get into the next video, which makes it very, very, very difficult to over-G this airplane. Unlike all of you will know, you can just bust through the max G limit here if you use a regular spring-loaded stick, because you simply don't understand and you don't have the huge forces on your hand to give you the feel of what's going on. Now, this is what happens to the pilot in real life. This is why it's not as easy to over-G the aircraft in real life as well, compared to, say, the one in DCS without using force feedback. So, guys, I think we're going to wrap it up here for this video. I do apologize. I know it's very technical. I just wanted to give you my thoughts on tuning this thing. It's not easy. As I said, it's a science and a black art all at once, because, yeah, you can use flight test reports, and you can use whatever information's out there, but you're never really going to be able to get it 100% exact until the day that all these developers start basically telling us and giving us all the force feedback information that is correct, that is suitable for sticks that can generate a lot of force going straight through DCS. An ideal world would be where all you do is you go into the DCS settings and you say, yes, I have a force feedback stick, check. And then you say, my maximum force that my stick can provide is X amount of pounds. And you tell it, okay, my stick extension is, say, 10 centimeters, tick. And then it will calibrate or recalibrate everything for you to give you exactly the forces that you need on your particular system. That's an ideal world. We are so far away from that, I think. I don't even want to tell, like, it's at the moment, it's all up to us to really tune it properly with whatever information we have. So with that said, I hope you've enjoyed this little technical overview. Do apologize if it was a little bit dry. In the next one, we're going to take out the F5 for a spin, and I'm going to show you exactly what it's like to fly this thing, because it's freaking amazing. And plus, it's taken me like over 10 hours to tune this airplane, which I'm now pretty delighted with. So having said that, stick around for the next one, and hopefully I'll catch you there. Adios.